Oh, beautiful community. Let me know in the comments if you can hear me. We're going to start with 3 or 4 questions that have often repeatedly come in over the last couple of days. And then I'm going to jump to engaging with you. And roughly the topic of our encounter today is going to be how we visualize not just the world after Putin, but also moving toward it. Let me hear no, let me know if you can hear me. So, first question is: friends on the left and right believe in a peace deal to stop the war and to stop escalating military support to Ukraine. Can you advise? Everybody's hearing me. So, I can tell you where these questions have come from this week. They're to do with Saga Ingetti and Crystal Ball going on the Joe Rogan show. And I have had lots of requests for a reaction video, which I've not done because I haven't watched that conversation yet. But let me start by saying something obvious. You know, in your country, you're all citizens in there together. So it's very important to not sort of externalize somebody out of the table of politics and say, oh, I don't want to talk to them. In the end, how that person votes is going to affect your life, and how you vote is going to affect their life. So it's really important to keep having conversations across uncomfortable differences. Now, having said this, there's a very basic thing that I think we should start off with here, put on the table. It ain't easy to figure out what is going on in a very different culture and in a very different political system. And the majority of not just the consumers of commentary, but the producers of commentary on this weird regime in the Kremlin largely started to engage with it when? In February 2022, not before. And is it possible by reading good articles, by following good podcasts, to have a deep grasp of a regime like that by following it for 6 months, 12 months? It's certainly possible to go much deeper, but it's impossible to get a deep understanding of a regime like that. And so this creates a real problem that all of the people having this conversation are kind of freshly arrived. And the perspective that I've been sharing with you on the chat channel, on the main channel before the war, not just after the war, before anybody was watching, was that the Kremlin was a kind of escalation machine. I think that's the term I used in my last pre-war video. And that since about 2015 or so, this was my impression, there was a movement towards something like what we saw in Ukraine. So what we are talking about is a situation where the regime is using war as a vehicle of stabilization at home, but also as a vehicle for overturning the international order, partly as a result of almost mystical thoughts about the return of Russian civilization to glory. And what we're looking at now is a regime that has sort of married this war, not just in the sense of the war against Ukraine, but in the broader sense of this escalatory pattern. And the view that I take is that the two can no longer be decoupled. In other words, the Putin regime will do war until it ceases to exist. And the only reason it wouldn't is because it has to take a break for reasons of capacity. So, therefore, negotiating a deal with Putin now is simply not consistent with the best historical and psychological and political account of what the Kremlin is like. But I want to say that that's a view that I have arrived at over years. And that view, in my case, began to form, if I look back on my notes, around 2015, 2016. To some degree earlier. I think Putin's civilizational turn was visible earlier. But you see what I'm saying? That whether your friends are right or wrong here depends on a close reading of the Putin regime. And you've got to give them the credit for, you know, uh, being understandably perplexed about why we're talking about pumping a war zone with more and more weapons, which is what it would look like to somebody who, it seems to me, wouldn't be in a position to understand the direction of the Kremlin. And so I think that these positions, sometimes they're not in good faith. Sometimes it's not good to talk about good or bad faith at all, but sometimes they're understandable. And the only way to overturn them is to have a deep conversation about the shape of the Kremlin and to begin honing in on the best Russianists, on the best experts, right? And see what kind of types of consensus might emerge there. And one consensus that has emerged is that Putin is using war as a mechanism of regime stabilization, perhaps unsuccessfully, but that's what's going on. So that would be the humility with which I would say to your friends, no, I think you've got completely the wrong analysis of the Kremlin, and the right analysis makes a deal um, not so much bad for Ukraine and bad for the world, but actually just um, undoable and unsustainable. Next question is, does the war end with Putin's death? I'm going to try to get to your questions after we've got through these. Um, and again, I know where this has come from. Um, I think Max Katz was on Deutsche Welle and he was asked, does the war end with Putin? And he didn't say definitively. He just said that Putin is uniquely the animator of this whole calamity. And there aren't too many other people who are as committed to it as he is. And therefore, it's probably likely to stop very soon after Putin goes. And another great Russian expert was asked to respond to this, and he said, no, you've got to realize that 2/3 of the Putin regime are now ideologues who might not necessarily have supported a full-scale invasion, but they've basically bought in to Putin's argument, not just about regime security, but about this civilizational challenge against the West. So I think that what we've got to understand is that it's possible that nobody else in Putin's Security Council would have started a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But we've also got to understand that there ain't no Democrats in Putin's regime, and it is constituted by a kind of assortment between people who are reluctantly going ahead with what's going on because it sustains their positions of power, and they're not terribly against it. They're just aware of the deleterious consequences of it for Russia. But there's then a big group, and maybe that's a majority, of people who do to some extent buy in to some of the ideological picture that is used to justify this war. And that means that while the cool, sober economics seminar kind of argument that says as soon as Putin is gone, it's overwhelmingly in anybody else's interest to begin looking at how do you remove the sanctions, how do you end the war as soon as possible. And that is truly compelling. But we've always got to understand that these kinds of predictions can often arise out of an unduly narrow conception of rationality, and that they can sometimes prove more optimistic than real history. That's preamble to an answer, but it's an answer that will be having another go at soon. So let's jump to the next question. You've spoken of elements in the West who want to appease Putin. Are they found all over the ideological spectrum? Interesting. By the way, sometimes soup things disappear after a while. So there's a risk if you throw them all in with questions now that some might drop off by the time 5 minutes from now I get to them. But hopefully I'll find them all. I think that there are elements, and we shouldn't call them elements because we're all in this together, but there are elements of various kinds in the West that I think support the idea of appeasing the Putin regime. I mean, how many could I think of off the top of my head? I'd say at least three, and three ways of categorizing this, but I think there are more. So let's start with one, and that would be elements of the right that are populist, exclusionary, and anti-democratic. Elements that want to break the democratic game. If you're on the right, you're watching this, there's no logical relation between being right-wing and being anti-democratic, but there are elements on the right all over the Western world that are committed now to breaking the democratic game. And if you follow the trail, you're going to see a lot of connections, a lot of conversations between these people and pro-Putin folks, including Alexander Dugin, indeed. So that's one bit. There is a faction, a growing faction on the right across the West that is giving up on counter-majoritarian institutions and checks and balances in democracy, and they are fanciers of Mr. Putin, or at least fanciers of Mr. Orban, and by extension, fanciers of Mr. Putin. So there is that. There is then, I think, a small problem of Putin fancy on the left. But it's not small because it's a small proportion of the left. It's small because the left is so small. Now, let's be clear. What is called the left in the United States is not the left by any reasonable categorization. So, for example, Black Lives Matter is an identity politics social justice movement. That's a reasonable categorization, whether you're a BLM activist or whether you are very critical of BLM. But BLM is not obviously left. Who is obviously left? Those who talk about class. Yeah, and there's plenty of those. They are just not electable in much of the West. And there, I think the majority of folks are clear about the evil that Putin represents. But there are a lot of people who, by a kind of residue of momentum from past discourse, are tempted to oppose US intervention and defend whatever it is the Russians might be, the Russian regime might be up to. And you're even seeing this in, for instance, a British politician like Jeremy Corbyn, the former leader of the Labour Party in UK. I recently checked what Jeremy was saying a few days ago, and I found him saying that there was a conflict or a war in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass, that needed resolution. But I would categorize that as part of a Russian invasion that occurred some years ago, rather than some kind of conflict that's fallen out of the sky. So I think there is a problem on the proper left of fully waking up to what is going on. But I think in a way, one might argue the biggest problem is in the center. And how would we categorize that problem? And so we're ending up punching all sides here. The problem tendentiously in the center is to think of Putin as a sort of negotiable, dealable character. And so you could see that reaction before the war. Um, at the start of the war, that as the war started, people were feeling, "Oh, come on, Putin, don't ruin all of our, capacity to deal with you. Don't incinerate all of your authority and credibility, because we still want to deal with you if we can get away with it." And so that sort of default normalization of Putin was, I think, a very dominant thing on the center in mainstream Western politics. And to give credit, because we're sometimes critical of them, to the Russian opposition, there were Russian opposition shouting about this being a problem for a couple of decades, maybe less, but up to a couple of decades. Last question before we jump to your questions. My core political values are about democracy, making it stick, making it work. Should I care about Russian opposition figures imprisoned by the Putin regime beyond just compassionate grounds? Is supporting them going to help democracy everywhere? So I think that there are lots of interesting lines of thought here. Let's just put one on the table. If you put aside reasons of human rights and outrage and compassion, and reasons to do with domestic Russian politics, right? So if we put that out of the equation, then I do think it still matters enormously. Because that defeat of the authoritarian imperialist project on the ex-Soviet space has to happen within borders, but to some extent across borders. Really has to involve Belarus and Russia. And whether it happens is going to affect everybody who's a neighbor. It's going to affect Ukraine. It's going to affect the Baltic states. It's going to affect everybody. So it seems to me a European commitment to democracy, no matter how reluctant we might be, and I'm not reluctant, but I know some people on Russia's borders are reluctant, draws us into being, in the end, quite involved with what happens inside Russia. Because what happens inside Russia is going to impact questions like, are the borders of all the states next to Russia secure? Is Russia going to become a globally destabilizing force again in 20 years in a very threatening way? And moreover, there are positives here. Imagine if there were, and perhaps that looks unlikely to us now, but if there were a kind of at least a partial victory for democratic forces on the Russian space, whether across all of Russia as a political unity, or across Russia segmented and separated, all of that really, really matters. And so it seems to me that strategically speaking, even if you don't care what happens inside Russia, we are stuck needing to care about the status of democratic forces in Russia. At the moment, I'm dealing with a few health issues and medical decisions that are taking up more time than I would like. And therefore, I'm live streaming a little more than is ideal because I'm so thrilled about sharing the next couple of properly produced essay videos on the main channel. I'm going to get to them as soon as possible, and I'm very excited about what they're going to be about. I think we can have a go. I think we can have a go at what is going on in the comments. I think that it's been a slow process waking up to what the Putin regime has become. And I think that the Georgian crisis in 2008, the Ukrainian crisis in 2014, still didn't wake enough people up, because there was a tendency to think that the Putin regime was still the Putin regime of 2002 or the Putin regime of 2001. And so it's been a very, very slow process. And what's happened is that most people just about woke up in February 2022. But actually, even that is only a kind of a partial awakening, and a few people are still not fully on board. So the evolution and degeneration of the Putin regime was a bit like water coming to the boil for people concerned about global security, and for people concerned about democracy, and for people concerned about the safety of Russian states, or of states on Russia's borders, who were potential victims of invasions. And we've got to recognize that there are the bits of Russian aggression that did take place, right, since 2008. And then there are the bits of Russian aggression that didn't take place. We could have had more. This whole conflict would have started with the Baltics and not with Ukraine. Then we would have been dealing with a very different picture. And then there is something else, that very few people in the West took proper cognizance of the lessons that could have been learned from the Chechen wars and the concerns that the um, Chechen wars should have raised for us about where Russian politics was going. Nika, that's not an answer to your question, but it's just a tiny dance around. Maybe we'll do an episode about Georgia at some point. I haven't been to Georgia since 1990. I spent a month in the mountains as a child in Georgia. Um, I'm a big admirer of Georgian wine. Let's see how we're doing with super questions, whatever these things are called. I saw a propaganda broadcast where a guest said that Putin will be gone, Nida is asking this, in 3 years, and the next person will be very progressive, which he thought was bad. This surprised me. Be careful with Russian propaganda. Much of it is filtered, at least at the level of the kind of people that are allowed to appear. So I'd be careful. There's certainly a lot of fear mongering about, Western values being imposed upon Russia and that being a complete disaster. Can you explain the regime's obsession, too much mushrooms asks, with traditional values and the idea that the West has lost its spiritual identity? So a few people have fallen for this a bit harder than they needed to in the West. This is political technology. It's not real. Putin is not that much triggered by social practices that contradict traditional values. He is basically not hugely homophobic, for instance. So I would say that this is a tool that the Kremlin uses for various purposes. One of them is to bait um, social conservatives in the West into supporting Putin, when in fact they don't need to have anything in common with the Putin regime. Relative time works. How you going? Can you share insights on what the average Russian citizen thinks about the US, the West, and Western democracy? Well, look, I was last in Russia in 2018. But I can make comparisons between the 80s, from the 80s till 2018. And of course, I have a historical sense about where we were at in the 20th century. In the 1980s, the West was seen as a kind of utopia and was painted in unfortunately idyllic terms. And people that got out of Russia were then very disappointed. And then people who were trying to build things in Russia had very false views about how much certain sort of magical solutions could be transported from the West. Then there was caution. a bit more resentment in the 1990s about Western models being again imposed on Russia in the 1990s, as well as some resentment on that was the perception. We can debate to what extent that's true. And then there was a perception of Russia being unheard and a bit humiliated on the international stage. And Putin grasped that and milked it for all it's worth. And the Russian propaganda machine has been extracting everything out of that. You see, propaganda cannot work unless it engages with something that is already present, um, items that are already swimming about in the culture. But these items are often subtle and latent. But if they are there, then the propaganda, if it's executed well enough, can magnify them. What we've got to is now a stage where there is genuine Americanophobia in Russia, except perhaps in the youngest generations who are urban. And that wasn't the case in the Soviet period. In other words, even in the Stalinist period, many uh, people hated the US government, but they didn't hate Americans. If anything, they thought if they bought into the whole, um, you know, Leninist, Stalinist story, they thought, well, wouldn't it be wonderful if US citizens also got their own Marxist revolution and their life problems were going to be eventually resolved? So there wasn't this kind of um, negative attitude to actual private citizens. And now you find more of that. But you've got to be still aware that there's a limit on this and that most Russians are still trying to stay out of having too strong a political position on anything. We're going to talk more about that depoliticized blob in the middle. So I think that's one feature that I've just brought out for you, that there's genuinely now a minority, but a big minority demographic in Russia that takes a negative view of not just Western governments, but Western citizens. Let's go down and see what's going on. Um, if the war was a NATO, if the Ukraine was a NATO partner, a NATO member or a NATO partner, there could have been. There's an interesting history there to be had about various forms of NATO adjacency that were being explored. The war would not have happened. Look, it's very important that when you criticize NATO expansion, the way NATO expansion happened, um, there are at least two directions to go. One is to say that it shouldn't have happened, but the other is to say that it should have happened in one go, so that Russia immediately woke up to NATO states on its border. And that would have been a very powerful obstacle to invasion. But, and I'm not going to resolve this balance now because that would take a longer conversation, but something needs to be said against what I've just said. And that's that the Putin regime was planning to test Article 5 in my analysis. And moreover, the Putin regime is still thinking it might get an opportunity to successfully test Article 5 and reveal it to be a kind of fraud as far as junior members of the alliance are concerned. So I myself have been concerned about a Russian intervention in the Baltics since about 2015. So I do think that NATO membership would have been a powerful reason for Russians not to invade. But I also think that it wouldn't have been a complete guarantee. To balance that out a bit further, we're going to have future conversations. Let's have a look at what else is going on in the comments section. The brief thing to say about Russia's relationship with China is that Russia is at risk of becoming a dependent junior satellite of China. What are Putin's views on the regime's corruption's effects on the war? The problem is that the extraordinary corruption of the military in Russia is not just a bug, it's a feature. And the reason it's a feature is not so that people could steal resources and cash from the military only. It's also so that the military does not become an institution that threatens power. The weakness of the Russian military is a constitutive feature of the practical elaboration of regime security strategy. Um, that's the brief thing to say about this. Hi, Joe. Glad you're catching this live. Would I be willing to talk to a political content creator? Yes. I don't do more of this just for health reasons, but I've gone on a couple of podcasts, for example, on Jake Bro. Thomas, thank you so much. Liana, you are always with us. NATO will not intentionally enter direct conflict with Russia. That will not happen because the second aspiration of the United States is to bring about that Ukraine retains its independence and some good degree of territorial integrity. But the first aspiration is to avoid a direct confrontation with Russia. And that would not be so necessarily if Russia were not a nuclear power. A friend of mine, Monsieur Nothing, says thinks that the war is NATO's fault. The war is kind of about and kind of not about NATO. Putin's objection is not so much to NATO expansion as it is to NATO's existence. And what Putin would not be satisfied by is NATO declaring clearly that Ukraine will never be a member. What Putin will be satisfied by is if he has a certain degree of control over all of Eastern Europe. So I think it's fairer to cast Putin's position as being one that's about a general challenge to the existence of NATO in the form that it exists, rather than just to expansion of it here and there around the edges. In one sense, it's about NATO, therefore, in another sense, it isn't much about NATO. But the idea that you can't correct mistakes we made in the way we handled NATO expansion, well, of course, we need to talk about that, and we will. Gabrielle, thank you so much. Would I be interested in creating a video on the relationship over time between Russia and India? Um, it's possible, but there would be an asymmetry in expertise that might disincline me from doing it. I might talk about the Russian side of that relationship perhaps a bit. Um, yep, yep. I think it's a wonderful question. I suspect we will end up talking about Russia vis-a-vis China and Russia vis-a-vis India over the next months more directly than we've done so far. So grateful for the super thanks. Um, Cheryl, the most visible successor to Boris Nemtsov is probably Alexei Navalny, even though they're quite different. And Alexei Navalny is in jail in appalling conditions. They've recently tried to deliberately infect Navalny with various kinds of bugs, deliberately try to keep him awake, and they're implementing a kind of torture regime to make him give up. But he won't, unless he simply just loses his health completely. I think that there is a wonderful conversation, Gerald, to be had about Russia 1900 till 1920, because that was when Russia lost what I regard as its second great of the last four democratic opportunities. The democratic opportunity in 1999 that's quite weak because the Yeltsin regime is in an awful state to organize a healthy transition. There's a better democratic opportunity in 1991, but then there are these two great democratic opportunities in 1910, but also perhaps in the early 1880s when Russia's most progressive and competent Tsar gets assassinated with a constitution on his desk and gets replaced by one of Putin's heroes, Tsar Alex III. Mark asks, how do we address the magical thinking in Russian culture, which seems to help people believe big nonsense ideas from the state? Do we need to replace it with some kind of magical thinking rather than to push cold rationalism? For the people who buy into the kind of magical thinking you're talking about, nothing short of the Putin regime running into a brick wall and smashing its forehead will do. But that is 20% of the population or less. With the 50 to 60% of the depoliticized population, they need to be not persuaded out of the magical thinking, but persuaded out of passivity by perhaps the perception that passivity is more dangerous than becoming proactive. That's a very difficult equation. But as far as your question goes, I think it only appropriately applies to that 20% of the population or less who have bought into this extraordinary quasi mystical storytelling that the Putin regime has put on replay. The ideology in the Kremlin cannot be stated theoretically, Daniel. It is not that Putin has extracted 7 ideas from Ilyin, for example, or some other kind of quasi-fascist thinker, and is applying them. It's rather um, an ideology that isn't an ideology, but an ideology in quote marks that is built up almost like somebody could build up a set of spiritual visions about the world, quasi-spiritual visions, quasi-mystical visions about the world, by going to some kind of a sage here, to some kind of a monk there, to some kind of a mystic here, reading a couple of texts, engage in a couple of occult rituals, and then sort of piecing it all together. So it's a sort of salad. But if you try to put the salad together and see common themes in it, perhaps the most common theme in that salad is that Russia, as a particularly backward and disparaged global power, somehow through a feat of stunning actions propels itself into the vanguard of global politics. And in doing so, expresses its true identity and also expresses the sort of meant to be role of Mr. Putin in all of this. Paul, I lived in Petersburg, and my observation is that older generations were supportive, the younger generations were against it. Um, and that the female population showed more affection toward the West. The female population does not show more affection toward the West if you look at the older female population in Russia. I don't know whether there's a difference, and I suspect you could be right, in younger urban folks. The generational divide is absolutely huge. And in fact, part of the reason why Putin started his war against Ukraine, let's say in 2014, is that he was concerned that he was simply losing the next generation, that you couldn't, unless you took a set of very significant actions to restructure the way things were going, you couldn't get that generation to be terribly impressed by what Putinism had to offer. So there's a real consciousness there. And some Russian commentators have spoken about it, that the next generation is kind of unavailable to Putin. And he has therefore tried to make it available to him by taking drastic action, and as a result, trying to create an environment in which he might re-indoctrinate them. But you're quite right. Young people in Moscow and Petersburg do not like what is going on. And even if you forget about young people, um, the number of people in Moscow and Petersburg who would generally just not think this is all a good idea would not be far below half. Without Hippocampus asks, I've heard Russian people on Vox Pop say that they had to invade or else they would have been invaded. How can they believe this given that a nuclear power basically becomes uninvadable? I think that there are two separate conversations here. One was that Ukraine was allegedly going to do something that it wasn't going to do. And so that this invasion is just a matter of local actions, right, in eastern Ukraine. But then there's a second sense that Russia could somehow become a victim of a NATO invasion. And the number of people who seriously thought that was not zero in Moscow at the time of the beginning of the war. And in the first days of the war, it was quite a lot higher than zero. So there really were adults who could speak English walking around, even in Moscow, on February 24th, who had traveled to the West, who thought that NATO was potentially going to attack Moscow. Now, ah, but it's true. It's true. There were some people like that. Greetings back to you, Gregory, um, from London. Google Day, bye bye. Radim Emperor is asking, who do you think would be most likely to take power in the event of Putin's demise? There are two stories. One is a soft and positive story on the model of what happened when Gorbachev and Khrushchev came to power, and that is to say, a moderate candidate who wants to dial down the radicalism and violence and aggression. But the other scenario is a collective junta who may be more radical and more disturbing than Putin, but whose capacity to stay in power for a prolonged period of time may not be great. Roberto. What do I think of Zelensky's handling of corruption um, in Ukrainian politics? I think that uh, it's important to say that Ukraine is not as corrupt as Russia, but that Ukraine is way more corrupt than any Western country by far. But part of this pluralistic, rather inclusive civic consciousness that has been accelerated by this war in Ukraine is the idea that corruption is an evil and it needs to be taken on. And it's especially an evil at the time of war. So I think we need to see where this goes. And we also need to be honest that solutions to problems at wartime do not translate into solutions to problems in peacetime. So corruption is an enduring challenge for Ukrainian politics. But I think that there is significant political momentum to take the situation in a positive direction. But it's important to be honest and not be politically correct about this. It's important that we should be able to talk about this. Now, I'm sure I've missed some things. So let's have a look. Is it enough for the depoliticized bit of the Russian population to just develop a political opinion, or does it have to be backed by real political action? It needs to be backed by a vision, possibly shared by a political leader. And it needs to be a vision that conveys to them that taking action will make a difference. The problem with waking up the depoliticized blob in the middle in Russia is that they don't want to take action that'll potentially lead to appalling consequences for their lives unless they feel it's going to make a difference. So there needs to be a story about how you're getting from A to B to C and how action makes a difference. And when that conviction carries through, and Greg Uden often talks about this, a wonderful Russian political philosopher, when there is the perception that there will be rewards for the action, you will see Russians willing to risk their health, their livelihoods, and their lives and take more action. But painting that story requires a bit more of a political vision than is currently available. And that's a challenge for the Russian opposition. Roz, thank you so, so much. And you are sharing that your father grew up during the time Nazi Germany. There are many similarities between how he described those times and how you describe Russia today. With that said, what do you think happened to the Ukrainians that were relocated? Do you believe Putin is capable of organized ethnic cleansing? Of course, Putin is capable. Putin is capable of all kinds of things he hasn't done yet. And some of the reasons he hasn't done them yet is he didn't have the capacity to do it. Um, do not underestimate how open Putin is to, for example, just leveling Kiev. In terms of folks that ended up in Russia, we've got to take this very, very seriously. There were people forcibly taken. There were children taken. There were people who wanted to get to Western Ukraine, but also felt, well, they felt they couldn't. And their options were to stay or go to Russia. Some of them made a decision between two evils. Yeah. There would have been some people who voluntarily, a good number who voluntarily went to Russia. So it's a story with many threads. But we've got to be very, very awake to it because we're talking about real people who have, in many cases, been taken to Russia basically against their will. And in some cases, it would be out of a kind of necessity because there weren't other options. In many cases, it was just against people's will. So you've got to be aware that this is a story we have to follow, and it's a story that matters, and it risks being lost. And here numbers matter because each number is a human life. 1,000 is not the same as 10,000, and 50,000 is not the same as 10,000. So this is really, really very important. Ethically, numbers matter. And so I think your question is very important. And the more journalism we get on this, the better. Jim, thank you very much. I am convinced I'm missing people. Um, but I mean, just a bit more, Roz. Um, this war is consistently backed by genocidal rhetoric. It's based on the rhetoric that Ukrainians don't exist. And it's very important to be clear that we have to look for that rhetoric uh, as it has been expressed in practice. And we've seen numerous expressions of that rhetoric in practice. If Russia would lose its grip on Europe because of a coming sustainable energy revolution, could food production in Ukraine be seen as a replacement for the pool? I think that however you cut it, the economic story isn't compelling about this invasion. In other words, um, even in 2014, Putin knew that doing what he did was going to be an economic disadvantage for Russia. The economic experts in the regime told him that this was going to be deleterious, and he said, "It's your job to make it work. My job is to do politics." The Putin regime knew that it was engaged in significant economic self harm when it was invading Ukraine. It felt that its own political justifications for the invasion were, on balance, made it worth it. Let's have a look. Um, Lots of fantastic questions. Gabriel, thank you so, so much. Um, I think that the danger to all states on Russia's borders is less now. And not just to the east, not just to the west, rather, but also to the south. Russia has basically evacuated itself out of both soft and hard power. And so, in many ways, there is a gratitude to Ukraine for um, concentrating Russia's aggressive forces there in a way that's allowed all different countries to breathe a sigh of relief. But Russia is progressively losing influence. RJ, thank you so much. Who or what is the biggest danger for Putin to lose his power? The biggest danger for Putin is a situation whereby people around him feel that the risk to their personal livelihoods and their lives of not getting rid of Putin is greater than the risk of staying with him and keeping him. And that is a situation that could arise in all kinds of scenarios, but we aren't near that kind of stage yet. Um, I do think there is a fundamental difference between Russia and other East European states culturally, and I do think this affects prospects for democracy. But that does not mean that there could not be a democracy in Russia or in Russian territory. Um, Eric is asking, if Russia breaks up, will that help with Russia's identity crisis, particularly the question of whether we're Asian or European? It completely depends on how Russia would break up. Um, if it's a violent and drawn out process, then no. If it's a less catastrophic process, possibly. But Russia could also, without breaking up, come to terms with its European identity. That's a long shot, but it's possible. Long shots do come and go historically, and it is sometimes possible to take them. It's very important not to inevitabilize this. Just how theoretical is talk of Russian democracy? If you're talking about democracy in 3 years from now, it's theoretical. If you're talking about democracy 10 plus years from now, um, it's not theoretical, but it would be fanciful to think that Russia would look like a West European country. But what would not be fanciful is, for instance, to have a court system on Russian territory that actually worked, that wasn't just a product of pre prepared political decisions. Um, with change in Russia, there are prospects of Vlad Vexler. Dim Sum is asking, what are the prospects of me visiting with Vlad Vexler visiting Russia again? Um, after things change. But even if things change, I'm not Russian enough to live in Russia. Why is no one very vocal about Karamurza and others being imprisoned? Well, partly because Alexei Navalny is the leading part of a political project that poses a risk to the Putin regime. And Karamurza is a man of great moral clarity who is refusing to stand by and be an observer from outside about what's happening. And he wants to take a stand and put his body on the line. But Karamurza is not a leader of a political movement in the same way that Alexei Navalny is. That's partly why we aren't talking about him enough, but we need to talk about him more. Berg is saying, I'm a Russian 26-year-old. I left for Kazakhstan when mobilization started, and then from there to Turkey. I got denied my residence permit. So now I plan to return in the hope that I will not be mobilized. One of the next forks in the road is whether the Putin regime will be doing gradual, bit by bit, rolling mobilization, or whether there's going to be a significant wave of mobilization to come. Both possibilities are completely real. Beautiful friends, we're going to have quite a few more lives soon on chat, and a few here on the main channel. And there is something that comes up in the comments almost more than anything else. But funnily enough, making a video about it is difficult because the sort of thing people really want to hear about, but it's not the sort of thing that people would necessarily click on if you made a video about it. So that's a challenge for me. And that might be the topic of the next video on the main channel. And I am learning a lot. So far, health has only allowed me to put a bit of time into it, but I'm learning a lot as I try to frame this in a way that really speaks to all of us in this community. So I'm very grateful to you. Doug, I'm going to take your question and then we're going to say goodbye. I'm very grateful to you for allowing me to do this kind of exploration. And I really hope that this video will be with us in a few days. Um, How close is the doomsday clock to midnight given the situation in Ukraine, Russia, China, Taiwan, and other authoritarian versus democratic states? At the moment, Russia is the only sort of World War III level global nuclear risk. It's very important that there's a lot of reasonableness behind the way that Western powers have stopped freaking out as much as they used to about Putin's nuclear threats, and we got more of them just a couple of days ago. But there is a permanent nuclear risk that this war leaves suspended. And it's very important that what we're not talking about enough is risk of a strategic nuclear exchange. Too much conversation is about Putin using nuclear weapons in Ukraine. But my own analysis is that the more rationalistic, the more dryly rationalistic models of whether Putin will use nuclear weapons in Ukraine are actually closer to tracking reality. But the more dryly rationalistic models about Putin's readiness for World War III don't entirely track Putin's thinking. And that's a disturbing truth that does not need to keep us up at night. So we're not right on the edge, but it's a disturbing truth that's worth being talked about because it's important for all of us to both feel safe and work toward a world where people across the globe don't feel stress on a Tuesday night about some ex-KGB character endangering them. And that's something I discussed in a recent nuclear rationality video on the main channel. I'm going to say thank you very much and good night and good afternoon and good morning for now. Lots of love and talk very soon, both here and on chat. I'm very, very grateful for your engagement, for your questions, for your contributions. And with all of this, we're just beginning.